Hey leaders, in this episode, Lorna and I are going to focus on why focusing primarily on your high need students can actually have a negative impact on building a culture of collaborative response within your school. We are then going to share some ideas and strategies related to how that can be accomplished and the impact it has on building collective capacity across your organization. So let's get started.
Leading organizations with intentionality and purpose is complex work, and dedicated leaders work tirelessly each and every day to build impactful cultures of collaboration. But effective collaboration is difficult and messy. The good news is you don't have to do it alone. Join the Jigsaw Learning team for leading collaborative response, sharing insights for leaders committed to establishing, refining, and deepening collaborative response in their organization.
Welcome back to episode 36 of the Leading Collaborative Response podcast. We are Kurtis and Lorna Hewson, lead learners and co-founders of Jigsaw Learning. So we know a common problem we experience in schools is that sometimes it feels like we're talking about the same students in every single conversation.
We hear that frequently from schools and have experienced that as leaders in schools as well.
So we're going to start off with a bit of a controversial statement. Stop focusing on your highest need students.
Okay, so that should have created a little bit of cognitive discomfort for us of how can we stop focusing on our highest need students?
So there's a bit of a disclaimer here that we need to make right off the bat. And that is that we are not saying ignore your highest needs.
Okay, that's good. We make that clear.
But we are saying that when developing aligned and intentional layers of collaborative structures in your school, the collaborative team meeting cannot be a space where you're focusing on your most complex students or learners that are presenting some of the most perplexing challenges. So in this episode, let's review the layers of collaboration, why the collaborative team meeting cannot focus exclusively on high need students over time, and how we can intentionally redirect or focus our attention to other students in an effort to focus on instructional practice.
So really, you've laid out for us that we need to start back with a little bit of review of what do we mean when we say layers of team.
Right.
So we talk about through collaborative response, when we think about that blue puzzle piece of collaborative structures and processes, there's a reason it's twice as large as the other pieces. It's really critically important. And in that, we talk about 4 layers: collaborative planning, collaborative team meeting, school support team meeting, and case consult. And we know schools will call different meetings different things. These are kind of categories.
Yeah.
But let's just kind of break down these a little bit first. So collaborative planning. This is really where we're looking at engaging in instructional conversations that are going to impact all students.
This is typically teachers that are getting together to look at common assessments, unit planning, how do we impact instructional practice across our classrooms, but really focusing in on that full instruction.
Yeah, absolutely. So we know a lot of schools that engage in this work. We engaged in this work, not calling it collaborative planning. We had professional learning communities that were established at grade levels. We know high schools that have department teams that are engaging. Really, there's lots of different ways that you can engage in collaborative planning. But the idea is, in those conversations, we're not focusing on individual students, we're looking at overall cohorts.
Well, and just thinking that we need to be able to have a team and time to focus on instructional practice as a whole.
Okay, so the collaborative team meeting, we often say that we're introducing one more meeting type that is going to, in time, reduce the number of meetings. So let's come back to the collaborative team meeting. It's unique to collaborative response, and there's a really intentional format. And it's in that space we're saying, stop focusing on your highest needs students. And the reason that we can say that with confidence is because of those next 2 layers.
Absolutely.
Of team. So talk a little bit about the school support team layer.
So really needing to be able to have a space to talk about students with more intensive needs, and that comes to the school support team. And this is a team that usually involves admin and your learning support. It might be counselors.
Yeah.
Some of
Members
those,
of, depending on where you're located, special education
yeah,
leads,
more
whatever.
specialized roles
Yeah,
that are working to support either individual students or perhaps sometimes at small groups of
sometimes.
students too, depending on and really focusing in on that idea of intervention. So, what do we do outside of the classroom in addition to what's happening in the
Mhm.
classroom to support these students because we've recognized that there's a
So
need?
in my school support team meeting, we might talk about, 2 to 6 students that have come to our attention through either a referral process or just our own interactions and awareness of what's going on in classrooms. Sometimes we'll have a student that is on our agenda for multiple weeks because we are just tracking what's going on. This is a student perhaps in crisis that we just need to keep really close tabs on. We often say, I know that you talk about this as being the hub, that
Yeah.
the decision making that happens in that team may be that we need to move to a next level of look at supports beyond the classroom or even beyond the school, or it may be we need to go back and help support classroom practice and instruction. Maybe it's we've noticed a trend and we're seeing some professional learning needs that
Mhm.
are surfacing as a result of this team. So,
Yeah.
probably the easiest team to explain, yet has multiple iterations within a school, is the case consult. And we say that's just an umbrella term for any
Mhm.
time you're coming together with one student on the agenda. So, we're meeting with a family to follow up on this student's individualized education plan. We have the appropriate teaching or teachers or support staff that are engaged in that conversation. That's a type of case consult.
Mhm.
A student had a crisis in the school yesterday, and we need to meet today to talk about what went on, what's our plan, our next steps moving forward. That's another type of case consult. Again, one student on the agenda, and we're bringing the right people as part of that conversation.
And again, that might include families as well,
Yeah.
depending on the situation.
So the idea with that case consult, and we've often, when we've had schools reflect on what do you already do within your school and what category would it fit, we've often seen a school that goes, oh my goodness, I understand why we're feeling so stretched and overwhelmed. A lot of the conversations we're having fall in that case consult layer,
Yeah.
where it's one student at a time. And we were doing that as a school as well until we move towards this collaborative team meeting that we'll come to here in a moment.
I was in a school not too long ago and we did a little bit of that inventory
Mhm.
around what are the team meetings that you have in place. And all of them, all of their team meetings were case consult. And so this whole school was running ragged because they were constantly having meetings, but all of them around one student at a time.
Yeah, and my experience has been that it's not to say any of those meeting structures are not valuable
No,
or
no.
supported, but this is why the layers become so important. Now, this is where, of course, we're going to be dealing with students with complexities,
Absolutely.
with more intense learning needs, with more challenging personal situations that they're
Mhm.
experiencing.
Yeah.
Those students are absolutely coming to the forefront at that school support team layer and the case consult layer. Absolutely.
Mhm.
Which is why we say stop focusing on your highest need student at the collaborative team meeting.
So one of the problems with this is that if we are focusing on that small group of students at every time that we are meeting,
In every layer.
then we have no opportunity to be able to talk about students who may just require a bump, like they might just need a couple of strategies in order to be successful, or the development of a particular area for support that might only take a little bit of time for us to provide that support.
Mhm.
If we don't have space, because we've consumed that space with students that have most intensive needs. If we don't have that space in collaborative team meetings where we can talk about the strategies that we can employ for many students, then what happens is those students end up requiring more and more and more supports, and then
Absolutely.
do end up at the table for the
Well, and we saw
solution.
that
Yeah,
within our own school of how many students did we have on individualized
yeah.
program plans, because that was our mechanism to be able to respond. And sometimes those were really difficult conversations to come into, because for me as a teacher, if I knew what to do, I'd have done it already. And I'm looking for a fix. I'm looking external
Yeah, for
with
sure.
this. And again, we're trying to, through our collaborative response work, build up that collective efficacy and that building of practice. So let's take a moment to look at that collaborative team meeting, because if we don't understand that, the rest of this conversation is really hard
Yeah,
to
for
engage
sure.
in. So the collaborative team meeting, we'll be right back to continue this episode. The introduction and establishment of the collaborative team meeting is a vital first step in implementing collaborative response, but it takes some careful planning and consideration by leaders. When introducing it to the staff team, it's important for leaders to be intentional and focus on growing understanding of how it functions, to place focus on classroom instructional practices and responsive supports. Join us for the online workshop, 4 Mistakes Leaders Make When Planning for Collaborative Team Meetings, part of our Supporting Collaborative Response series. In this on-demand workshop, I share 4 mistakes we often see leaders make when planning for their first collaborative team meetings, whether the structure is new to the school or being reintroduced for another school year. I also share numerous ideas, resources, templates, and samples to help leaders address these mistakes. Purchase the workshop, and you'll also have the ability to replay all or any portion of it as you wish. Register today to learn more about how to avoid these common leadership mistakes and how to set up your first collaborative team meetings for success. And now back to our conversation. The collaborative team meeting is very intentionally designed that we have structural components in place, like norms, like roles, and we would say those structural components should exist at every layer of team, some of those basics. But then we want to engage in a part of the conversation around celebrations. What have we seen as success for students? And then most importantly, can we articulate, reflect on what it is that we did? That's an important part of the process. But then key to the collaborative team meeting is the focus on a key issue. So let's just review what that looks like quickly. I say, Lorna, who is a student that you've brought, and what is a key issue that you have? We often say 8 words or less, 30 seconds. What is that key issue that we have? Then where do we go from there? When you've articulated that I have this student and the key issue, I've narrowed it down to this that I'd like to concentrate on today.
So we're really focusing in on that key issue, not necessarily the student that has been named, but the next
And we don't
piece-
need the story. We just need
no
the
stories.
key issue.
So we narrow it to that key issue, and then we add other students. We ask if anyone else has students around the room who might also benefit from strategies to address that key issue.
Right. So in doing that, we're trying to make it our problem to investigate rather than it being just yours. It also takes the attention off, well, let's just focus on this one student.
Right.
And really tries to shift the attention to, so if this is the key issue, what could we do?
Understanding that even though we're naming children in that conversation, the strategies that we come up around that key issue may apply to many, many more.
Right. So that's where, from that, then we open up a space of what could we do? And we want to be able to think in it with innovation in mind, being able to say, what if, I wonder if we can reference our continuum of supports of, is this something we could try? What about this? We want to just put up an or engage in an opportunity for people to openly explore and ask questions. about each other's toolbox. When you say do that, how does that look like? How do you do that in your room? And then coming back to determining, okay, for the student you've brought, what's one thing you're going to try from this list? What's one thing I'll try for the student I have in mind? And with the intention that the strategy is intended for one, but good for all. We're really actualizing universal design.
Well, and we
doing this.
truly are engaging in a brainstorm that values every idea that comes forward.
Okay.
So we want that brainstorm to be as extensive as possible in that moment in time.
Okay, so if we understand that, now here's where the trouble happens when I bring up Kurtis, who is a student with significant needs and challenges in the classroom. First off, it might be hard for me to narrow down to one key issue. We've also seen the experience of, I want to make it apparent for others in the room of all the things that I've tried, all the things that I've done. This is, I'm not bringing this up due to lack of competence. I'm struggling. I don't know what to do. And we often see in that conversation that it's hard sometimes to attach other learners.
Oh, absolutely.
Because of some of the uniqueness of the complexity for this one particular child.
Which is one of the reasons that we say to avoid the story, because every time that we tell the story for a student, then we are becoming more and more detailed in those circumstances, which doesn't allow us to generate that key issue that other people can find their way through.
Right. And so I've seen this over and over when we've done that, of when you turn and say, so Kurtis, who's a student you have? And I say, well, I have this student who's kind of like that, but let me tell you what's different. And then they go off onto another tangent. So that's one of the difficulties. The other is, if I have a student with significant needs in mind, and we see these ideas and classroom practices being generated, I may not be able to see or acknowledge something that I think would work in this particular situation, because one thing is not going to,
so many things happening.
one thing, one change in the classroom practice is not likely to have the impact or significance that I'd want to be able to see.
However, when we have created that brainstorm, then our next step is to be able to go back to each of the teachers who have identified a student and to choose one strategy that is going to work for that student as an action.
Right.
And when they choose that one, there can be a number of strategies that on that list that they know are not going to work for that child, but they get to choose the one because they know that student best. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't have a student with more intensive needs brought up in that conversation, because there might be lots of things around those key issues that also apply for those students.
And we're going to get there too, of the idea that we're going to actually impact practice for our high-risk needs students by not focusing on them. We're getting there. Okay, so the other thing too is, if I commit to a particular action, I'm going to try a strategy that you suggested with this student with significant needs and challenges, the likelihood of it having impact is much lower, which over time, I might not come to value these conversations as much, because I'm not seeing the value or the impact coming out of it. And worse, you've offered me two different ideas now that haven't worked. I'm not as open to the sharing and the collaborative nature of the conversation if things that I'm trying or taking back aren't necessarily working for me.
Now, remembering that if a student and if a teacher is highly challenged by a student who has significant needs, we have a space to be able to talk about that student.
That's where
this is where we identify to the school support team that we need to have a programming and planning conversation around that student.
But not in the
Not
collaborative
in the
team.
collaborative team meeting.
So it was with some reflection when we think about when we were first engaging and then even introducing the collaborative response work and specifically the collaborative team meeting to schools, that we just in the last couple of years have had the aha of, oh my goodness, we were running collaborative team meetings
Yeah.
like mini case consults where we'd say, who's a student you've brought? And you bring up the student, you'd share everything going on. We'd say, maybe you could, you'd say, oh, there's some ideas there. And then we turn and say, who's my student? And you're on the hot seat for a few minutes. And then I'm on the hot seat. And again, we were seeing some impact for it. And at the time we thought pretty significant impact.
Yeah.
However, reflect back now and go, nowhere near the impact
Not
that
what's
this
happening.
process
Yeah.
now has.
Yeah, and when we think about that key issues process, you have to have patience with starting that with your school teams, because it does take a while to understand the intention behind it and to follow that process really carefully to ensure that you are focused on practice as opposed to individual students. The other thing is that when we look at that collaborative team meeting, we we naturally, as teachers, and have always been requested when we want to talk about students, we've always been asked to bring their whole story, tell us everything
Bring
they've tried,
evidence.
tell us what's happening with the family, what is their circumstances currently. Like, we are asked to tell that whole story, and so teachers naturally do that. This is not the space for us to
So what you
engage in
just
that
described
conversation.
is really beneficial in the case consult layer.
Absolutely.
The collaborative team meeting, essentially what you're saying is it goes against some traditional ways of being
Yeah,
that we have. When we say,
it
who would you
does.
like to talk about? Naturally, my mind goes to the student that is keeping me up at night, that I'm really struggling with, that I'm not sure what to do. We'll be right back to continue this episode.
Feeling overwhelmed with the expectations being placed on teachers, leaders, and educational systems to respond to the diverse needs of our learners?
Are you wanting to take your PLCs and RTI efforts to the next level?
It definitely takes a highly coordinated framework of structures and processes to maximize the collective capacity of your team to ensure success for all students. Collaborative Response is that framework.
Order your copy of our bestseller, Collaborative Response, 3 foundational components that transform how we respond to the needs of learners, which includes access to a comprehensive companion website. Join the thousands of schools using the framework to ensure high levels of success for students and staff. And now back to our conversation.
So it takes time for teachers, for teams to really learn how to engage in that process. And one thing that we often suggest or see schools do even is demonstrate a fishbowl and model a collaborative team meeting in front of the whole staff, and then talk about what was the process that you saw and what do you note that is different than, and we've got tons of videos.
We'll
you
actually
can do it through a video as well.
We'll include in the show notes an area of our website that has it's focused on observing a team meeting where you can see a clip. There's some resources to help
and some questions
support
to ask you
of that.
to
Absolutely.
reflect on.
So I can definitely empathize with people in school who say it feels like we're talking about the same kids over and over again, because we were living that. And actually, in the early iterations, our collaborative team meeting was reinforcing that over and over. So this has been a significant shift. So let's now get to the how. How can we intentionally, I mean, it's one thing to say the collaborative team meeting is not supposed to focus on high need students, but how do we strategize and make that really, really intentional? So I think one of the first things that I see schools do is at the start, when you're first learning this process, maybe you don't make that determination of who. maybe you don't, just as you're learning to get used to focusing on norms, roles, the key issue process. But I would suggest fairly early on making a slight adjustment to the pre-meeting organizer and putting criteria at the top. And we've seen this done. We'll share an example in the show notes of at the pre-meeting organizer, which is intended to be completed in preparation for the collaborative team meeting.
And which is really just a note page. It's not gathered, or it's not telling extensive stories.
Right. In fact, the best ones we've seen lately have student name, key issue, and then even right underneath it says 8 words or less. In that. But having criteria at the top, where in this one school it said, do not bring a student on an individualized program plan. The idea is we already are having conversations about that student. Do not bring a student that the admin or learning support or special education team are already aware of. Do not bring key issues outside of our locus of control. And they had spent some time talking about what do we mean when we say locus of control. And then try to bring yellow zone students. And we're going to talk about what we mean by that yellow. Having that criteria at the top became really, really effective. For us.
Sure.
Just some starting criteria.
And with those pre-meeting organizers as well, we often recommend to schools that you actually print them out and don't fill them out on your computer, because of course the space there expands. And we have a tendency to, as that line keeps moving, we keep writing. So if you've got the pre-meeting organizer just on a little strip of paper and that's all you can write, then it limits those thoughts.
So I think that's one. I think another is if our staff team doesn't understand what the layers of collaboration look like in our school, then it's really hard for me to say, but when are we going to talk about Kurtis? If it's been laid out and clearly articulated, the purpose of each one of our layers, it's easy for me to understand of, I need to talk about this particular student, but I know this is the appropriate space. So I'm going to reach out, and I would love to set up a conversation about just Kurtis as part of our case consult layer of team.
Well, and having those clearly articulated on a poster or something that is visible to teams in their meeting space, but being able to have them clearly articulated allows us the assurance that we have help. We have support. We've got lots of teams that are meeting on a regular basis to support the needs of students. And
absolutely.
That feels great to be able to know that.
Well, we'll share some samples in the show notes of that. And when you say we have many teams, we often hear of the small school of, but there's only 5 of us. We still encourage lay out the teams, because even though you may be engaging in these layers in the same
people, it might be the same people,
same agenda. The agenda still might be broken out to reflect each of those layers. So I earlier said to focus on the yellow zone. I think this is the absolute key, and it's why data and evidence is a foundational component within collaborative response. Is we often say when schools can start introducing data and evidence into the process and use it to help flag who we should bring to the collaborative team meeting, then things really start to make sense. So in that, we use just simple color coding that basically says we're going to, through our data, through color coding our things, when we have a piece of data where it shows a student not yet meeting expectation, we color code it red. When they're approaching expectations, they're yellow, meeting expectation, green, and exceeding expectation is blue. Then we want to say in the collaborative team meeting, don't bring the students where the data indicates is red, bring the yellow.
And again, because we have another space where we are talking about those students who are evidencing in that red space.
So once we're able to use that color coding of the data, then we can say, bring a student of concern from the yellow part of our data. And again, we're now not focusing on those students furthest away from where we would like them to be as far as our academic or other indicators of data. We're now focusing on the students who are close.
Yeah.
And it may be much more likely that implementing this small adjustment in my classroom instruction, trying a strategy that you've suggested, might be what leads to success. And the paradox in thinking here is by those continual adoption of new practices, new ideas that I'm putting in place, intended to be for not necessarily my highest need students, my practice is growing and it has
Yeah.
impact on all students, particularly our students with intensive challenges or needs within the classroom. So again, it's that understanding that by not focusing on our highest needs students, we're actually providing support that is going to have immense benefit for them, which again, it's a little bit of a paradox in our contemporary thinking.
And another beautiful benefit of being able to have that collaborative team meeting focused on instructional strategies, instructional practice, it also allows us to bring in conversations about students who are in the blue.
Yeah.
Students who are exceeding expectations, but we know there are some things that we can still do to provide additional support for those students. So we can actually have a conversation with a team about a student who is doing well, but how do they do better?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think through that, that's been one of my key learnings through this process that I didn't understand when implementing as a leader myself is I'd now want to have in virtually every collaborative team meeting, let's have one enrichment conversation. It follows the same process, but it's also building out a toolbox that will benefit all through this. Okay, so I mentioned small schools before, and we get this question all the time, Lorna. I want to ask you this question at this point in this episode. What advice would you give a small school who shares with you that they're able to, the great thing about having a small school is we're able to cover all of our students in the collaborative team meeting. And we've heard this before.
Yeah, we have.
How would you respond to that statement?
So my first response to that question is around the word cover.
Yeah.
So when we express that we are covering all of our students, I would need to be able to say, what does that look like? So when we say cover, is it merely an opportunity to talk about every student, give an update, and to tell the rest of the team what's happening for that student?
Yeah.
So there is no problem solving. There is no investigation around what other things could we do. It's just merely reporting them.
And I would argue that we're not saying that's not valuable.
Not valuable.
The idea is, we're providing a response to students, but it's not being done in a way that is forcing us to reflect on our practice, to articulate our practice, to share and to grow in practice. We're supporting students, but there's a good chance all of us leave that conversation not without our instructional practice growing.
Right.
If we could say that.
And our primary purpose in the process around key issues for collaborative team meetings is growing our practice.
Right.
And as a collective, that collectively we are sharing and working through some ideas and sharing ideas that I do in my classroom, you do in yours, that, we're creating these banks of ideas that will respond to the needs of students that we have currently identified, but we can reference those banks at any point in time, and even outside of those conversations. So really that question around, we can cover every student. We want to be careful about what that looks like.
Yeah, we often say the collaborative team meeting looks like you're talking about students if you're not really looking at it in depth, but really you're just using a student to leverage a conversation about instructional practice. What do you do in your classroom? What do I do in my classroom? So one of the things that I recently did with a small school, in fact, it was a group of colony teachers. And for those not familiar, within the province of Alberta, we have many Hutterite colonies, which are essentially single classroom schools, one-room schoolhouses, where as a teacher, I might be the only teacher in that building, and I might have a range of students from kindergarten all the way up to grade 7 or 8, let's say. And so when they bring up a student, the people in that, like, that's the very definition of a small school.
Yeah,
And
it is.
not only do they know that student deeply, they know the siblings, everything, and have probably taught that student for a number of years. So what we did in our meeting is we actually took the name right out of the conversation. We would say, Lorna, on your pre-meeting organizer, I know you have the name of a student. Don't share it yet. Share the key issue. That's it. And then what we did is said to everyone, okay, think of a student that you have in your colony school that has a similar, write down the name, but don't share it out loud. Then we brainstormed, and then we came back to say, all right, Lorna, who is the student, just the name, and what's one thing that you're going to try for them? And when we, at the end of the conversation, stopped and reflected on it, it was the teachers that say, man, taking the name out of this conversation and only bringing it up when it came to action was really an effective way for us to not get bogged down and focused on that one student. And again, has been the point of this conversation, often that highest need student that we have. So we hope that this has given you a few ideas and has justified our controversial statement that we started off with stop focusing on your highest need students. We hope we've explained what that means and what that looks like. As always, check out the show notes for a number of resources that we've shared. If you need to learn more about collaborative response, love for you to check out our book. We'll put the links for that. And please share this out with a colleague, like, subscribe. We want to be able to continue to grow this work, because we know it has incredible impact for not just our students, but for our staff teams as well. So as always, reach out if you have any questions, any suggestions, samples to be able to share. We'd love to engage in that conversation. And we can't wait to engage with you in the next episode of Leading Collaborative Response.
See you soon.
For more on collaborative response, visit jigsawlearning.ca or join the JL Insider to receive access to newly added resources and content.